around him. And it's, you know, it's not that he was throwing fits and kicking over C-stands and, you know, throwing boxes.
Every single day, I drop another story from the Golden Age, those wild moments that built an era people still can't stop talking about. If you want to keep these memories alive with me, hit that subscribe button. It costs nothing, but it means everything. Thank you for sticking around. Now let's dive in. Ron Howard, calm, collected, and always the eye in Hollywood's wild storm, known for his class, his patience, and the way he treats people with respect. But when someone brought up the dark side of the same industry that raised him, something changed in his expression, like he'd seen too much to ever forget. He once said quietly that people wouldn't believe what some legends became once the cameras turned off. According to him, that so-called Golden Age wasn't so shiny after all. It was a world built on silence, pressure, and fear. A place where fame gave certain stars a free pass to act however they wanted. Those same stars who shaped America's dreams were, behind closed doors, breaking hearts and crushing spirits. And now, all these years later, Ron Howard seems ready to whisper the names connected to that chaos. The people who built the legend while living double lives. And right at the top of that list, Errol Flynn, the devil behind the charming smile. Long before slick secret agents or rum-soaked pirates hit the screen, there was Flynn.
And so I'm living that dream, and it's wonderful.
The man who made danger look smooth. On screen, he was every bit the fearless adventurer. Off screen, Howard said he was something else entirely. Wild, impulsive, and ruled by ego. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn stormed into Hollywood in the 1930s and blew up overnight after Captain Blood dropped in 1935. He had it all: looks, fame, and that rebellious spark that made him unforgettable. But the story behind that fame, that's where the real storm begins. Studios made millions off Errol Flynn's charm, building an empire around that dazzling grin. But behind all that glitz was a man drowning in chaos, trapped in addiction and spiraling fast. By the early 1940s, everything in his world had turned poisonous: fame, friends, and even his own habits. Then came 1942. The year everything exploded. Flynn was hit with charges involving two young women, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen. The story splashed across front pages everywhere, tearing the country apart. In court, Flynn laughed through the whole thing, acting untouchable, like fame was his personal shield against justice. Warner Brothers rushed in their most powerful lawyers, and fans camped outside the courthouse, screaming his name. Behind the scenes, insiders whispered about shady deals and missing witnesses who might have been pressured by people with way too much influence. And when the verdict came, Flynn walked free, acquitted. But the darkness didn't fade. It just followed him for decades. Years later, private letters from 1978 surfaced, and what they showed was chilling. Flynn bragged about his past behavior, even mocking the people who once said they feared him. That was when Ron Howard said something inside him changed forever. He realized Hollywood could protect people who crossed serious lines, all because they knew how to flash a smile and play the hero on screen. To the public, Flynn stayed the symbol of rebellion and danger. But behind the velvet curtain, insiders knew the truth. He was a warning sign, walking on two legs. The same charm that built his fame became the poison that ruined him. After years of heavy drinking, drugs, and financial wreckage, his body finally gave out. In 1959, at just 50, Flynn collapsed in Vancouver and gone in an instant. The autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and ulcers, but as Ron Howard once said, the real cause was simpler. Flynn lived in extremes, taking from everyone and giving nothing back. His downfall became the ultimate symbol of Hollywood's broken soul. A hard reminder: charm can hide cold hearts, and fame can't shield anyone forever. Kirk Douglas was the man who just couldn't stop fighting, on and off the screen. To Ron Howard, Douglas was the very definition of contradiction. On camera, he stood for justice, courage, and loyalty.
First and foremost, and, you know, to this day, if you get him up in front of an audience, he's pretty entertaining.
But off camera, people remembered someone completely different, sharp-tongued, intense, and always ready to explode. Born Isur Danielovich in 1916 to a poor immigrant family, Douglas clawed his way out of hardship with pure grit. Every role, every audition was a battle for survival. And when Spartacus hit, it catapulted him into global superstardom. Suddenly, he had it all: money, fame, and power. But behind the fame, insiders whispered about a temper that could flip a room upside down. Crew members said working with him was like walking through a storm, and you never knew when thunder would strike. He could go from charming to furious in seconds, leaving people tense and shaken. Actress Deborah Paget once said he didn't just want to lead a scene. He wanted to control everyone standing in it. That hunger for dominance didn't fade, no matter how big his name got. Ron Howard, who studied Douglas's performances while mastering his own craft, later said he sensed a fire behind that perfect Hollywood grin, a rage under that smile, the kind that eats away at someone piece by piece until nothing's left but pride and pressure. And that storm followed Douglas for decades. Throughout his long career, old Hollywood insiders shared disturbing whispers about how he treated women, stories that never quite faded. Some writers and people connected to the industry have discussed troubling claims tied to the 1950s involving Natalie Wood, mentioned through her sister Lana's comments in a 2018 memoir. The darker parts of Douglas's legend still cast a shadow that refuses to fade. These stories have been argued over for decades, and since many of the key people are no longer here to speak for themselves, Ron Howard always points out that these old allegations reveal more about the secretive, messy culture of the time than about proven facts. Douglas was never charged, and just like so many other powerful men of that era, the whole situation got buried under Hollywood's wall of silence, a silence so strong it outlived the truth itself. Even after his passing in 2020 at the age of 103, the controversy didn't return as cheap gossip. It came roaring back through professionals finally daring to talk about what old Hollywood really was. They described a world ruled by charm, fear, and absolute control. On set, Kirk Douglas could change the energy in a heartbeat. One moment, the whole crew was inspired, and the next, everyone was walking on eggshells. Director Stanley Kubrick, who worked with him twice, once said, "Douglas was the most driven man I've ever met, and the hardest to control." That line stuck with Ron Howard for years. Howard later reflected that the real lesson behind Douglas's career wasn't about acting skill or box office fame. It was about how power, left unchecked, can twist everything around a person until they start believing the rules just don't apply to them. Douglas carried himself like a man above consequence, and Hollywood let it slide because success was the only thing that mattered. When Douglas accepted his honorary Oscar in 1996, millions saw an older man trying to wrap up his story with grace. But Howard saw something else entirely, the final act of someone who had spent a lifetime outrunning his own demons. Beneath that standing ovation was an uncomfortable truth that Hollywood still hates to face, that some of its biggest legends didn't just build their fame on talent and charm, but on fear, control, and dominance. Faye Dunaway, the queen of cruelty. If Errol Flynn symbolized corruption and Kirk Douglas embodied explosive rage, then Dunaway brought a whole new kind of danger to Hollywood. To Ron Howard, she proved that darkness in the industry didn't always show up through violence. Sometimes it hid behind ego, humiliation, and a chilling kind of control that could freeze an entire set. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Faye Dunaway rose like lightning through the ranks. Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, Chinatown in 1974, hit after hit. She seemed untouchable, almost mythic, with that icy, magnetic aura that made everyone stop and stare. But behind that glamorous mask, insiders whispered about the storm she brought with her.
He was an entertainer first. You know, he was a monologuist. And he was a singer, and he never was really a stand-up comedian per se, but he was a humorist.
Crew members spoke about outbursts, impossible demands, and assistants who didn't last long, treated like they were just part of the furniture. On the set of Mommy Dearest, her co-star Rutanya Alda once said, "You could feel the fear on set, like everyone was waiting for an explosion." That movie was supposed to expose emotional abuse, but many said it ended up mirroring Dunaway's own behavior. While she played Joan Crawford, a woman often described as controlling and cruel, Dunaway reportedly channeled that same cold fire in real life. Director Frank Perry even admitted later that he nearly walked away from the film entirely because her outbursts were too much. She threw objects, tore into makeup artists, and once refused to shoot until every light made her look perfect. Ron Howard later brought up her name when talking about how power in Hollywood can twist even the most gifted stars. He said Dunaway was the perfect example of what happens when an actor's need for control turns into full-blown emotional domination, a warning that no amount of talent can excuse cruelty when the cameras stop rolling. And the chaos didn't stop with the Wicked Lady. Faye Dunaway's reputation only got wilder as the years rolled on. She was said to have slapped a cameraman on the set of Don Juan DeMarco, and crew members claimed she humiliated assistants so badly that the production had to shut down for an entire day. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, once said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." That line stuck because by the 2000s, the fallout finally caught up with her. Hollywood stopped calling. Directors whispered her name like a warning. Too difficult, too unpredictable. Once a symbol of perfection, she became a name studios avoided completely. In 2011, after being removed from a Broadway production of Tea at 5, Dunaway pointed fingers at everyone but herself. The woman who once ruled sets with an iron will suddenly found herself locked out of the same world that made her famous. When a journalist later asked Ron Howard about her legacy, he chose his words carefully but didn't hold back. She chased perfection so intensely that she forgot compassion, he said. Her downfall wasn't a sudden crash. It was a slow fade, stretched over years of burned bridges and bruised egos. The star who once defined glamour ended up isolated, even at events meant to honor her own films. To Howard, Faye Dunaway became a warning wrapped in legend, proof of what happens when talent loses touch with empathy. He once said, "People talk about power in Hollywood, but power without grace turns to poison." And from that, Howard moved to another giant, John Wayne, the so-called tyrant of the West. Few Hollywood figures ever stood taller. To millions, he was America, the cowboy, the soldier, the unshakable hero who never backed down. But for young Ron Howard, who grew up watching those old westerns on a flickering black and white TV, the truth behind that rugged image hid something much darker. Ron Howard once said that the moment he learned who John Wayne really was, the hero image shattered like glass. "I stopped seeing the hero," Howard admitted. "I saw the bully who wore his country like a costume." That realization hit him hard, the kind of truth that changes how you see everything you once admired. Born Marion Morrison in Iowa in 1907, John Wayne climbed his way through the studio system by selling the perfect fantasy, a brand of unbeatable toughness, the rough-edged masculinity that America fell in love with. But behind the legend was a man who built his fame on control, not courage. By the 1950s, Wayne wasn't just acting. He was preaching a worldview. To him, disagreement meant weakness, and progress looked like betrayal. On his sets, patience didn't exist. He ruled through pressure and intimidation, not respect. Technicians said one wrong move could make him explode, and when he did, the entire room froze. Actor Christopher Mitchum once said, "When Duke was angry, the air froze," and added that you either stood with Wayne or you were gone. Howard later said, "That kind of environment isn't art. It's fear pretending to be discipline." Wayne's power didn't just show up in yelling matches either. He reportedly belittled women on set, mocked indigenous performers during Western shoots, and dismissed black actors who tried to break free from stereotypical roles. His influence came with a chill that kept people quiet, and that silence protected him for years. Then came his infamous 1971 Playboy interview. And even today, it still shocks people. In it, Wayne made harsh statements about indigenous land rights and gave opinions on black Americans that revealed deep prejudice, all while bragging that movies needed men, not whiners. Those words resurfaced decades later, painting a very different picture. Not of a patriotic hero, but of a man trapped in outdated extreme beliefs that the world eventually stopped cheering for. On the set of The Searchers, John Wayne clashed brutally with director John Ford over how to portray Ethan Edwards, a man written as hateful, broken, and vengeful. Ford wanted honesty, a raw look at obsession and racism, but Wayne fought back hard, wanting to keep his hero image untarnished. In the end, Ford won. The character's cruelty bled through loud and clear, and so did Wayne's own chilling coldness. Years later, when Ron Howard studied that same film at USC, he said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." That line hit deep. It wasn't just a movie anymore. It was a mirror. Even near the end of his life, as cancer weakened him, Wayne never backed away from his beliefs.
I don't know if he ever studied acting anywhere or not, but he really built his own sense, his own aesthetic.
He brushed off critics, blamed the changing world, and held on tight to that outdated worldview until his final days in 1979 at age 72. To millions, he died an American hero. But to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his story stood as a warning. Power shaped by prejudice doesn't grow wiser with age. It grows bitter. Howard once summed it up sharply. The myth survived, but the man behind it never deserved the legend. And just when you think the darkness of old Hollywood couldn't go any deeper, there came Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. For Ron Howard, Polanski's name represented one of the hardest truths the industry ever tried to ignore, that brilliance can exist right alongside evil. I admired his films before I knew who he really was, Howard admitted. Then I realized talent doesn't absolve a person. Sometimes it hides them. Polanski's rise once looked unstoppable. Genius-level direction, international fame, and total creative control. But behind that shining reputation, there was a darkness that Hollywood refused to face for far too long. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents, Roman Polanski's life began in chaos long before Hollywood ever heard his name. He survived the horror of Nazi occupation during World War II. Tragedy marked him early, shaping the shadow that followed him forever. His early films, like Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby, turned him into a critical sensation, a filmmaker who could turn fear into art, dread into beauty. But behind the brilliance, there was always something darker brewing. Ron Howard later said that the darkness in Polanski's films didn't just come from his imagination, it came from the man himself. That wasn't just storytelling, Howard explained. It was a reflection of someone hiding storms behind the camera. Then came 1977, the year everything shattered. Polanski was arrested after a situation involving a young teenager following a photo session. The evidence was undeniable, and he eventually pled guilty to a charge involving unlawful conduct with a minor, a serious admission that carried enormous weight. But before he could be sentenced, Polanski fled the United States and ran to France, refusing to ever come back. Hollywood exploded, instantly and violently divided. Some condemned him without hesitation, while others defended him, calling him a misunderstood genius or a tortured artist. That split tore through the industry like a scar that never healed. For Ron Howard, who was still a young filmmaker watching all this unfold, the reaction was heartbreaking. They spoke of art, he said years later, while a child's life was broken. To him, that moment revealed something rotten at Hollywood's core, how the business could twist itself into knots to protect fame instead of confronting the truth. Instead of facing justice, Polanski turned his self-imposed exile into one of the darkest stains on Hollywood's record. The case never disappeared. The debates, the defenses, the excuses all kept resurfacing. His absence became a brutal symbol of how the industry often failed to hold its most powerful names accountable, even when the truth was impossible to ignore. Committed by its own powerful insiders, Hollywood's hypocrisy hit full display with Roman Polanski. Even after fleeing justice, he kept working overseas, directing films, collecting awards, and in 2003, winning an Oscar for The Pianist. That moment left Ron Howard stunned. He called it surreal and stomach-turning. As the audience at the Dolby Theater rose to their feet in thunderous applause, Howard stayed seated, frozen in disbelief. I thought of that girl alone at 13, he said later, and wondered how that applause must sound to her ears. The cheers echoed through Hollywood like a haunting reminder of how the industry could celebrate genius while ignoring the damage behind it. Decades later, that same willingness to separate brilliance from responsibility still made Howard furious. In 2020, when Polanski won France's César Award, protesters stormed out of the ceremony in outrage. And to Howard, that scene finally looked like justice, showing up late, but at least showing up. He told Vanity Fair in 2021, "It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day, that a monster doesn't become less monstrous just because he knows how to frame a shot." Those words hit like a hammer, cold, direct, and long overdue. Today, Polanski still lives freely in Europe, shielded by legal loopholes, but followed everywhere by the shadow of his past. His name has become a permanent scar on the industry that once applauded him. To Ron Howard, Polanski's story represents everything that poisoned the so-called Golden Age, a system that protected artists but ignored the people they hurt along the way. "Hollywood forgives anything," Howard once said bitterly, "as long as the lighting is good." And if Polanski exposed the industry's hypocrisy, then Mickey Rooney exposed its illusion. The lie that a charming smile could cover up all the pain and destruction hidden just behind it. For Ron Howard, who grew up watching Mickey Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, learning the truth about him felt like a punch to the gut. He was the face of joy, Howard once said. But behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it. The man who once symbolized laughter turned out to be carrying a storm inside. Born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first massive child superstar. The kid who could sing, dance, and charm anyone. By 18, he was the highest paid actor in America, with MGM building an entire empire around his grin and boundless energy. But that kind of fame, it twisted him early, and as he grew, so did the chaos that came with it. He married 8 times, cheated repeatedly, and gambled away fortunes like money meant nothing.
He was really the rock on which the show was built in every way.
His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, once joked bitterly, he was the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. But behind closed doors, the laughter stopped, and the pain began. In 2011, troubling accusations surfaced involving his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and her son, both accused of isolating Rooney and taking control of his finances during his final years. But the truth is, the darkness didn't start there. Long before that, stories about Rooney's harsh temper were already legendary. Former co-workers described him as unpredictable, sharp-tongued, and impossible to please. One moment he'd be cracking jokes, and the next he'd tear someone apart with words that cut deep. Judy Garland, his closest friend during the MGM years, once said privately that he could make you laugh one minute and break you the next. Garland, who was already struggling under the crushing weight of studio control, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executive, Iga carried part of the blame for the emotional toll she suffered during those years. To Ron Howard, that realization was chilling, that behind the shining smile of Hollywood's golden boy was another story of pain, ego, and emotional damage that fame refused to hide. By the 1960s, Mickey Rooney's once unstoppable career was crumbling fast. Scandals, addictions, and financial chaos chased him everywhere he went. The Hollywood golden boy had become his own downfall. In a 1979 interview, Rooney said, "I've lived 1,000 lives," but as Ron Howard later reflected, he lived them all for himself. That line hit like a truth bomb, raw and heavy. Even in his old age, the fire in Rooney's anger never really died out. He blamed everyone, studios, ex-wives, old friends, even fate itself, for how his life fell apart. And when he passed away in 2014 at the age of 93, the tragedy didn't stop there. He left behind less than $20,000, and heartbreakingly, his body went unclaimed at first until friends gathered funds for a small, quiet burial in Los Angeles. To Ron Howard, Rooney's story was the last piece in a long, painful puzzle. Proof that behind Hollywood's brightest smiles often lived the darkest secrets. He made the world laugh while he was dying inside. Howard said softly. He called it the saddest kind of evil, when someone's pain becomes their performance and nobody notices until it's too late. For Howard, these stories were never about revenge or shaming. They were warnings. The so-called golden age of Hollywood wasn't golden at all. It was built on silence, pressure, and carefully hidden lives polished to perfection under blinding lights. The truth was ugly, but it was real. And as Howard once said with chilling honesty, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films. They're the ones the spotlight protects. What do you think about that truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story hit deep. And don't forget to subscribe, because more untold stories from Hollywood's hidden past are still waiting to be uncovered.